Well, thank you very much, Paul. Vice-Chancellor, Professor Johnson, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, can I add to Paul Johnson's welcome and to say how pleased we all are that you were able to give up your time to attend this conference over the next couple of days. It's a great opportunity, I think, for all of us to reflect on the important issues facing countries in our zone, and given the calibre of the speakers in the program, I'm sure that it'll prove a very worthwhile exercise. My task, as Paul said, is to speak for about 10 minutes to set the scene for the discussion session on the economic development of the zone, on Australia's place in that development, and on the challenges facing us as we go forward. As we're all aware, the development of economies in this region has been nothing short of remarkable, commencing with the post-war expansion of Japan, and over the last 2 decades, dramatic growth in China, India, and the ASEAN nations. The Australian economy is 3 times larger than it was in 1991 in purchasing power parity terms. ASEAN's is 4 times larger, India's nearly 6 times larger, and China's 11 times larger over those 2 decades. Expressed another way, in 1991, China's economy was just 3 times larger than Australia's, and India's twice as large. Today they're 12 times and 5 times larger, respectively. For the modern day developed world observer, the tendency is to consider this explosive growth to be the result of third world economies finally emerging from their pre-industrial agrarian states, and indeed it is. But it should also be seen as a restoration of a much longer term status quo. China and India are simply regaining the importance they had for much of their history. Up until 1800 or so, these 2 countries accounted for around 50% of global industrial output. 100 years later, this had fallen to 5% as the Western Industrial Revolution made them dramatically less competitive. Since the 1970s, this trend has been reversing as China and India take advantage of low-cost labour, favourable demographics and significant improvements in productivity. China is expected to return to its pre-industrial revolution share of close to 30% of global GDP by the late 2030s. And these nations have come from almost nowhere over the last 2 decades to be our major trading partners. In 1990, China and India had no material trade with Australia at all. Today, two-way trade between Australia and China amounts to $115 billion, and China takes 27% of our total merchandise exports, making it our largest customer ahead of Japan at 19%. India comes in at $20 billion, or 6% on that measure. Western Australia, as we heard earlier, plays a very important role in our nation's relationship with China. Indeed, our Premier, Colin Barnett, is fond of saying that Australia's trade with China is really a Western Australian story. As the Premier says in his message in the program this morning, around half of Australia's merchandise exports to China emanate from this state, and that will increase over the rest of this decade. WA has recorded annual average export growth of nearly 16% over the last 5 years, and China's obviously a very big part of that. The question, of course, is whether, or to what extent, China and India can continue to record these sorts of economic growth rates going forward, and we'll no doubt have some pretty interesting discussion on this morning. With the focus on China and India, it's easy, and I'm afraid very common, to ignore the importance to Australia of the ASEAN nations, those 10 countries located in Southeast Asia. This is an economic community of nearly 600 million people with aggregate GDP of $3.3 billion, fully 3/4 the size of India's, which has also quadrupled over the last 20 years. More significantly, ASEAN's two-way trade with Australia is 4 times the size of India's. We send more goods to ASEAN and 4 times the amount of services, education being a leading example, and our imports are 50 times greater from ASEAN than from India. Many Australians are unaware that the ASEAN nations have resolved to form a single economic community to build their competitiveness. The blueprint they've adopted contains all the sorts of things that you'd expect to see in such a plan, with milestones for their achievement set out. Things like creating a single market for goods and a single production base through the free flow of goods, services, capital and skilled labour, competition policy, intellectual property rights, taxation reform and so on. In their 2007 Cebu Declaration, these nations resolved to accelerate the process of unifying by 5 years to be completed by 2015. Notwithstanding the deferment of that date just last week, the process is reported to be 70% complete. I think quite an incredible thing when you think of the divergence of those economies from Singapore, highly industrialised, all the way through to Myanmar. This is a very significant issue for Australia in terms of both the expansion of our export markets and the additional competition presented by a highly productive neighbour. That leads me to conclude with some comments about what Australia needs to do in order to maintain its place in the sun. Our federal government recognised the critical importance of Asia's growth to our own economic welfare in its commissioning of Ken Henry's white paper, Australia in the Asian Century, which was, as we know, released recently. It canvassed the need for the development of stronger relationships across the board, from increased Asian language skills, links between schools and tertiary education institutions and student exchanges, to business and diplomatic alliances. Australia's new membership in the region-wide liberalisation, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is an important move in that regard. But the most critical thing we need to do is to make sure our own economic house is in order first. We must ensure that we have an open, transparent, flexible, efficient economy. Australia's links into Asia have been forged in the main through innovative supplier-to-customer initiatives, albeit aided at times by diplomatic support. Government's role must be to get the settings right and to step back to allow the market to create wealth. I think we've got a long way to go in terms of what we need to do. Australia's capital productivity and labour productivity have grown at very low rates over the last decade, hidden from view by record terms of trade, high investment levels and an increased workforce. When those factors turn down, it'll only be through growth in capital and labour productivity that we will maintain an acceptable level of economic growth. So what do we need to do? It's pretty simple, I think. Embark on a renewed round of microeconomic reform, building flexibility in labour markets, achieving real reform of regulation and of our tax system, and investing in infrastructure. If we do these things, the Asian century, the century of our zone, will reward us all very richly. Thank you.